In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japan entered the sky with confidence forged over years of preparation. Its finest pilots, men trained patiently through the long 1,930 seconds, were not simply aviators, but craftsmen of aerial war. Many had logged hundreds, sometimes thousands, of flight hours before ever seeing combat. They had fought over China, refined their tactics, learned discipline in the air. When war came in 1941, these men struck Pearl Harbor, swept across Southeast Asia, and shattered Allied air power with alarming speed. To the outside world, it appeared effortless. To Japan's commanders, it felt like vindication. These pilots were meant to be the backbone of Japan's aerial supremacy. The Zero fighter, light and deadly, was designed around their skill. It demanded finesse rather than brute force, tight turns, close combat, perfect judgment. In the first year of the war, it worked. Allied pilots, often less experienced and flying inferior aircraft, were outmatched. Loss ratios heavily favored Japan. Each victory seemed to confirm a belief that careful training, elite selection, and spirit could overcome industrial disparity. For a time, the sky belonged to them. But embedded in that success was a quiet irony. Japan's pilot training system produced excellence, not abundance. It took years to make one of these men. Losses, once unthinkable, became irreplaceable. As the war expanded over vast oceans, endless islands, and relentless sorties, the pace of combat accelerated beyond anything planners had anticipated. Planes could be built, pilots could not. Every veteran lost was not just a casualty, but a library of experience erased. By 1942, the strain was visible. Battles like Midway and Guadalcanal did not just cost aircraft. They consumed the men who knew how to fight best. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours, less seasoning, and little chance to learn before being thrown into combat. The air war no longer rewarded perfection, it demanded endurance. And Japan's system had been built for neither speed nor recovery. The revelation came too late. The war's intensity burned through Japan's finest before they could even reach their prime. What had once been a decisive advantage became an unfillable void. And as the skies slowly began to change hands, another truth was taking shape far from the front lines. In training fields and factories where a different kind of war was being prepared. Within Japan's air services, the fighter pilot was more than a specialist. He was a symbol. From the earliest days of training, aviators were immersed in a culture that fused technical mastery with moral obligation. Discipline was absolute. Failure was intolerable. Loyalty to unit, emperor, and nation was treated as a weapon in itself. Those who emerged from this system were among the most capable pilots in the world, conditioned to believe that skill and spirit, combined, could overcome any enemy. In the air, they fought not merely to win, but to fulfill an ideal. Yet embedded in that belief was a stark contradiction. These pilots were trained with extraordinary care, but employed with startling expendability. Once combat began, they were pushed relentlessly to the front. Rotations were rare. Rest was limited. Survival was not a planning factor, it was a personal matter. The expectation was clear. A pilot existed to fight until he could no longer do so. In this environment, experience was not preserved. It was consumed. The irony was cruel and structural. The qualities that made these men lethal: aggression, fearlessness, refusal to disengage, also shortened their lives. Japanese doctrine emphasized close combat, decisive engagement, and pressing the attack even when conditions turned unfavorable. Withdrawal carried shame. Caution invited suspicion. In battle after battle, veteran pilots stayed in the fight longer than reason advised, trading survival for victory in the moment. The sky rewarded their courage, but the war did not. As losses mounted, the system revealed its limits. There was no mechanism to pull seasoned pilots back as instructors in sufficient numbers. Training pipelines could not accelerate without sacrificing quality, yet the demands of the front allowed no pause. New pilots arrived with reverence for their predecessors, but without the time or guidance to replace them. Heroism became policy. Sacrifice became strategy. And slowly, imperceptibly, the edge began to dull. The revelation was not dramatic. It emerged in statistics, in shorter training hours, in squadrons that flew with fewer veterans each month. Excellence, once Japan's defining advantage, proved too costly to sustain. And while pilots continued to climb into the sky with undiminished resolve, the structure beneath them was already weakening, just as another air power was learning how to turn survival itself into a weapon. The first major losses came quietly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the roar of engines and the smoke of burning fuel. In the early battles of the Pacific, Japanese pilots continued to win engagements, but the cost was rising. Over the Coral Sea, above Midway, and in the long struggle around Guadalcanal, veteran aviators began to disappear from unit rosters with unsettling frequency. Each name removed represented not just a pilot lost, but years of training erased in seconds. At first, the numbers seemed manageable. Victories still outpaced defeats. The sky still felt familiar. Behind that confidence lay a powerful belief that Japanese pilots were, in some essential way, invincible. Their early successes had fostered the assumption that superior skill and fighting spirit could defy probability. Commanders expected losses, but not erosion. Aircraft were counted carefully. Pilots were not. The assumption was that excellence would continue to reproduce itself, as if courage alone could sustain the balance. It was a belief reinforced by tradition and by the intoxicating memory of early triumphs. The irony was that overconfidence hid the most dangerous enemy of all: attrition. American airmen learned quickly. They adapted tactics, avoided turning fights, and relied on formation discipline and firepower rather than individual brilliance. Each engagement chipped away at Japan's most valuable asset: experience. Even when Japanese units claimed tactical success, the exchange rate was quietly shifting. A victory that cost one veteran pilot was no victory at all. As casualties mounted, recognition set in with painful clarity. Squadrons that once flew with seasoned leaders now relied on men with fewer hours and less confidence. Missions grew longer, losses came faster. There was no reserve of experience to draw upon, no second line of veterans waiting to take command. The realization spread through the ranks that the air war was not being lost in dramatic defeat, but in steady depletion. The revelation marked a turning point. Japan's air forces were no longer merely fighting the enemy in front of them, they were racing time itself. And while commanders struggled to understand how the balance had shifted so quickly, across the ocean a different air doctrine was already being tested, one built not on invincibility, but on survival, rotation, and replacement. From the beginning, Japan's fighter pilots were shaped to believe they were the best. Training was selective, punishing, and unforgiving. Those who survived it emerged convinced that skill, discipline, and spirit placed them above their enemies. Early victories reinforced that conviction. Against Allied forces still adjusting to modern air war, Japanese pilots appeared unstoppable, outflying, outmaneuvering, and outthinking opponents who seemed slower to learn. In squadron ready rooms and command briefings alike, a quiet certainty took hold. This was an elite force, immune to the rules that governed ordinary armies. But combat is indifferent to belief. As the war deepened, the truth emerged with increasing clarity. Japan's pilots were not being defeated in spectacular collapse, but erased incrementally. Losses accumulated in ones and twos, scattered across hundreds of missions. A veteran failed to return from a patrol. A flight leader vanished over open water. Another aircraft burned into the sea without witnesses. Each absence was small enough to ignore until it wasn't. By late 1942, the rate of loss had outpaced the system designed to replace it. The irony was that Japan's early success concealed the danger. Victories were still being reported. Enemy aircraft were still falling. The outward appearance of dominance remained intact, even as its foundations were being hollowed out. Commanders focused on aircraft counts and tactical outcomes, not on the invisible erosion of experience. A battle won today could cost the war tomorrow, but the accounting did not yet reflect that truth. The struggle lay not in acknowledging losses, but in understanding their meaning. The myth of invincibility encouraged persistence where adaptation was needed. Pilots were pushed to fly longer, fight harder, and accept greater risks. Withdrawal remained dishonorable. Survival remained secondary. In this framework, attrition was not a warning, it was a test of will. And so the test continued, battle after battle, draining the very resource that could not be mass-produced. The revelation, when it came, was sobering. Japan's belief in superiority had blurred the reality of modern industrial war. Skill alone could not withstand sustained pressure. Excellence, without replenishment, became a finite commodity. By the time the danger was fully understood, the most experienced pilots were already gone, and the air war had shifted irreversibly. The myth lingered even as the evidence mounted. And while Japan clung to the idea of invincible warriors, its enemies were learning a harsher lesson that wars in the air are not won by legends, but by systems. Somewhere beyond the Pacific horizon, those systems were already beginning to turn. By mid-1942, the arithmetic of the air war had begun to change. What once appeared as isolated losses now formed a pattern too large to ignore. For every victory claimed, Japan was losing something it could not easily replace. Sortie after sortie thinned the ranks of veteran pilots, and the ratios grew steadily worse. The war was no longer a series of decisive encounters. It was a continuous drain, measured not in headlines, but in absences. The shock lay not in a single defeat, but in the realization that time itself had become an enemy. Japan's elite pilots had been meant to serve as the vanguard of empire, a sharp edge that would cut quickly and decisively. Instead, they were being worn down by distance, fatigue, and relentless operational tempo. Training schools could not keep pace. What had once taken years to perfect was now compressed into months. Flight hours were reduced. Combat seasoning became a luxury. The belief that quality alone could sustain supremacy persisted, even as the evidence contradicted it with growing urgency. The irony was stark. Few nations possessed pilots as skilled as Japan's early war veterans, yet skill without replacement proved fragile. Aircraft production could be increased, fuel could be allocated, but experience, once lost, vanished entirely. Each new pilot arrived with reverence for those who came before him, and with an unspoken awareness that he was being asked to fill a role too large, too soon. The sky no longer forgave mistakes, and there was little time left to learn. The struggle unfolded quietly within squadrons. Veterans flew beside novices who had never seen combat before, arriving at the front. Formations lost cohesion. Tactics once executed instinctively now required explanation mid-flight. Some young pilots survived their first encounters only to be lost days later. Others never returned from their first mission. The gap between what the war demanded and what the system could provide widened with each passing month. The turning point came not with a single order, but with a forced shift in philosophy. Japan moved, reluctantly, from a doctrine of elite quality toward one of necessity-driven quantity. More pilots were trained, but fewer were ready. The Air Force grew on paper, even as its effectiveness declined. In trying to replace what had been lost, Japan exposed itself further, trading depth for speed and precision for desperation. The revelation was unavoidable. The finest pilots, the irreplaceable core of early success, were gone. In their place stood brave but inexperienced men, asked to fight a modern air war without the foundation it required. And as Japan struggled to hold the line with diminishing returns, another power was preparing to overwhelm the skies not with legends, but with numbers, rotation, and time firmly on its side. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japan's aerial dominance appeared fixed, almost immutable. Its pilots had swept the skies from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean with a confidence that seemed to defy reversal. Within the imperial command structure, air superiority was treated not as a temporary condition, but as a given and advantage earned through years of preparation and sacrifice. The belief persisted that, whatever the enemy attempted, Japan would always retain control of the air. That certainty shattered as the losses accumulated. By late 1942, the disappearance of experienced pilots was no longer abstract or deniable. Squadrons that had once flown under seasoned leaders now assembled around men barely older than their aircraft. Commanders found themselves planning operations without the pilots required to execute them. The shock was not simply that losses had occurred, but that they had struck at the core of Japan's capability, the men who knew how to fight and survive in the air. The irony lay in the replacements. New recruits arrived eager, disciplined, and loyal, yet profoundly unprepared. Their training had been shortened to meet urgent demand. Flight hours were fewer. Combat instruction was compressed or skipped entirely. They inherited aircraft designed for experts, machines that rewarded precision and punished hesitation. What had once been an extension of a veteran's instinct became an unforgiving test for novices. Courage could not compensate for experience, and the sky offered no second chances. The struggle that followed was systemic. Japan's air forces were forced to fight while simultaneously trying to rebuild themselves. Every mission risked further depletion. There was no safe rear area in which to recover, no rotation system to preserve what remained. Instructors were needed at the front. Survivors were flown until exhaustion or death removed them. The resource being consumed was no longer fuel or aircraft, it was human capital refined over a decade and lost in a year. Gradually, the nature of the war changed. Japan's air units no longer sought decisive domination. They fought to hold ground, to delay, to survive. Defensive patrols replaced sweeping offensives. Missions were planned around what could be spared, not what was required. The initiative slipped away, not in a single battle, but through a continuous narrowing of options. The revelation was unmistakable. Japan was no longer fighting for conquest in the skies, it was fighting to avoid collapse. The shortage of elite pilots had altered the trajectory of the air war beyond repair, and as Japan struggled to defend shrinking margins, its enemies were preparing something new, an approach to air combat that treated pilots not as expendable heroes, but as a renewable force in a war designed to last. As the war stretched into its second year, the strain on Japan's air forces became impossible to conceal. The best pilots, the men who had defined early victories, were increasingly absent, replaced by flyers who had learned under fire rather than through instruction. Those who remained were forced to adapt constantly, adjusting tactics not because doctrine demanded it, but because survival required it. Each mission carried the unspoken awareness that experience was dwindling and that mistakes were no longer buffered by veteran leadership. The irony lay in the nature of the fighting itself. Japanese pilots were still drawn into intense dogfights, often under punishing conditions that magnified every weakness. Tropical heat-strained engines and bodies alike. Long overwater flights left little margin for error. Combat occurred at close range, where split-second decisions determined life or death. These were the very conditions in which experience mattered most, and where its absence proved fatal. Attrition no longer struck randomly. It targeted the system's remaining strengths. Pressure mounted within the Japanese command structure. Reports from the front grew increasingly sober. Victory claims could no longer mask the steady decline in effectiveness. Units reported shorter mission, endurance, poorer formation discipline, and rising accident rates. The enemy was no longer surprised, nor intimidated. Allied pilots arrived in greater numbers, flying aircraft that improved with each iteration. The balance in the air was shifting, not dramatically, but decisively. In response, Japanese commanders attempted to reframe their tactics. Emphasis shifted toward interception and defense rather than sweeping offensive patrols. Pilots were instructed to conserve fuel, avoid unnecessary engagements, and protect key assets rather than seek decisive combat. But doctrine could not be rewritten overnight, and habits forged in years of training proved difficult to abandon. The adaptations came slowly, unevenly, and often too late for the men required to execute them. The deeper problem was structural. Even as tactics evolved, the underlying shortage remained. There were too few experienced pilots to anchor new formations, too little time to train replacements adequately, and too much pressure to keep aircraft flying regardless of readiness. Each adjustment was made under fire, each lesson learned at the cost of lives. The air war had become an unforgiving classroom, and Japan was running out of students who could graduate. By 1943, the revelation was unmistakable. The pilots who had once dominated the skies were no longer a match for the forces arrayed against them. Allied air superiority grew steadily, built on rotation systems, standardized training, and overwhelming production. Engagements that once favored Japanese maneuverability now ended in attrition-heavy exchanges they could not afford. The myth of qualitative supremacy had given way to the reality of quantitative imbalance. The cracks that had first appeared as minor stress fractures now spread across the entire structure. Squadrons fought bravely, often skillfully, but without the depth needed to sustain pressure. The sky, once a domain of confidence, became a contested and increasingly hostile environment. And as Japan's air forces struggled simply to hold their ground, a new phase of the war was approaching, one in which the question was no longer how Japan would win the air war, but how long it could endure what was coming next. The shock of mounting losses forced Japan into a race it was never prepared to run. Training programs were expanded, standards revised, and schedules compressed in an urgent effort to refill empty cockpits. Airfields that once echoed with deliberate instruction now rushed young men through accelerated curricula. Aircraft were scarce, Fuel was rationed, and instructors were pulled from the front only when survival allowed. The system continued to function, but it no longer produced mastery. It produced numbers. Within the command structure, there remained a belief that fresh pilots, properly motivated, could step into the roles once held by veterans. Discipline was still strict. Loyalty was unquestioned. The assumption persisted that courage and obedience would compensate for shortened preparation. But the air war had grown unforgiving. The truth emerged quickly, written in combat reports and casualty lists that told the same story with relentless consistency. The irony was inescapable. The higher the death toll climbed, the faster pilots were trained, and the faster they were lost. Flight hours fell dramatically. Some recruits arrived at the front, having barely mastered formation flying, let alone combat maneuvering. Aircraft maintenance suffered as well, stretched thin by operational demands and material shortages. The very effort to sustain the air war accelerated its decline, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of loss and replacement. The struggle played out in the skies over the Pacific with brutal clarity. New pilots entered combat facing opponents who had learned from every previous engagement. Allied formations were tighter, tactics more disciplined, and aircraft increasingly robust. Radar-guided interceptions, mutual support, and firepower-heavy designs reduced the margin for individual heroics. Japanese pilots, trained for close combat and aggressive pursuit, found themselves outmatched before they could bring their strengths to bear. Yet bravery remained abundant. These young men flew into combat fully aware of the odds. They pressed attacks, followed orders, and accepted risks with the same resolve as those who came before them. What they lacked was time. Time to learn, to adapt, to survive long enough to become effective. Experience could not be rushed, and the war offered no patience. The revelation was strategic and irreversible. Japan's early reliance on a small cadre of elite pilots had created a dependency that could not be undone under wartime pressure. When those men were gone, the system designed to support them collapsed inward. Replacement pilots did not fail individually. They were failed collectively by a structure that demanded excellence without providing the means to achieve it. By the time this reality was fully acknowledged, the cycle was entrenched. Losses demanded faster training. Faster training produced weaker units. Weaker units suffered heavier losses. The air war became a contest Japan could no longer control, fought on terms dictated by an enemy that treated pilots as a renewable resource rather than a finite treasure. And as Japan struggled to break free from this deadly cycle, the skies filled with aircraft produced in numbers unimaginable. Only a year earlier, signals that the next phase of the war would not be decided by skill alone, but by endurance on an industrial scale. By the later stages of the air war, the nature of combat for Japan's pilots had fundamentally changed. Men who once entered the sky, expecting to dominate, now climbed into their cockpits with a different calculation. Missions were no longer framed by objectives of victory, but by the hope of return. The struggle was no longer against an inferior enemy, but against exhaustion, probability, and time. Each takeoff carried the quiet question of survival. The irony was unmistakable. A force once celebrated for its offensive brilliance now measured success in avoidance. Pilots learned to disengage when possible, to conserve fuel, to break contact rather than pursue. These adjustments were pragmatic, even necessary, yet they cut against the very ethos that had defined Japanese air doctrine. What had once been considered dishonorable became essential. Winning the fight mattered less than living to fight again, if only briefly. Pressure mounted relentlessly. The skies grew crowded with enemy aircraft, flown by pilots rotated through training and combat with systematic precision. Radar warnings reduced surprise. Fighter escorts denied easy targets. For Japanese pilots, every engagement felt stacked against them. The constant threat of death wore down nerves and judgment. Morale declined not through cowardice, but through clarity, the recognition that bravery alone could no longer alter outcomes. The psychological toll was severe. Survivors carried the memory of fallen comrades, often lost within days of arrival. Units shrank, reformed, and shrank again. Sleep was fragmented. Confidence eroded. Even experienced pilots found themselves hesitating, calculating risks that earlier doctrine had forbidden them to consider. The air war had become an exercise in endurance rather than skill, a test of how long men could function under unrelenting strain. The revelation lay in what this transformation represented. Japan's early war strategy had relied on swift, decisive blows delivered by elite forces. That vision was now unattainable. The conflict had shifted into a contest of attrition, where industrial output, pilot rotation, and logistical depth determined outcomes. In this environment, individual excellence mattered less than institutional resilience, and Japan possessed too little of it. As survival replaced victory as the immediate goal, the broader implications became clear. Air units could no longer support major offensives with confidence. Defensive patrols were stretched thin. Losses, even when small, carried disproportionate weight. The Air Force was no longer shaping the war, it was reacting to it, struggling to delay the inevitable. By this stage, the transformation was complete. What had once been a war of strategic brilliance and tactical daring had become a slow retreat into necessity. Pilots still flew with courage and professionalism, but without illusions. The skies were no longer theirs to command. They were a hostile environment to be endured. And as Japan's remaining pilots fought to survive one more mission, the enemy was preparing to press its advantage further, introducing new aircraft, new tactics, and a level of pressure that would soon leave survival itself in doubt. The shock arrived not as a single order, but as a gradual reorientation of thought at the highest levels of command. By late 1943 and into 1944, Japan's leaders could no longer deny the condition of their air forces. The losses were undeniable. The skies were increasingly controlled by the enemy. Faced with this reality, strategy shifted not toward recovery, but toward accommodation of decline. Inexperienced pilots were sent forward in greater numbers, and tactics were adjusted to reflect what Japan still possessed, rather than what it had lost. At the heart of this shift lay a grim acknowledgement. The elite pilots who had once defined Japanese air power were gone. The men who replaced them were brave, disciplined, and loyal, but they lacked the depth of experience required for sustained air combat against a rapidly modernizing foe. Aircraft were fewer. Fuel was scarce. Training time continued to shrink. Commanders were forced to plan operations around sacrifice rather than preservation, seeking impact where endurance was no longer possible. The irony of this transformation was profound. Japan had entered the war believing in the supremacy of skill, spirit, and precision. Now, it turned to tactics that accepted destruction as inevitable. The emergence of special attack units, later known as kamikaze, was not a demonstration of confidence, but of constraint. These missions were conceived not because they were strategically elegant, but because conventional options had been exhausted. They were a response to imbalance, not a remedy for it. As these strategies took form, the turning point became unmistakable. Leadership began to recognize the full extent of the disaster unfolding in the air. Reports acknowledged shortages that could no longer be concealed. Operational planning assumed heavy losses from the outset. Aircraft were committed with the understanding that few would return. The language of command shifted subtly from victory to duty, from success to inevitability. The damage inflicted by years of attrition had reshaped not only the Air Force, but the mindset guiding it. For the pilots themselves, the change was stark. Many were barely trained, sent into missions with limited understanding of tactics their predecessors had mastered over years. The burden placed upon them was immense. They were asked to compensate for structural collapse with personal resolve. Some flew conventional missions under impossible odds. Others were assigned roles that offered no return at all. In both cases, the absence of experienced leadership was keenly felt. There were fewer mentors, fewer guides, fewer voices to teach survival. The revelation at the core of this moment was unavoidable. Japan's finest pilots, the irreplaceable foundation of its early success, were gone, and no strategy could summon them back. Their replacements, though courageous, could not carry forward a doctrine built for a different kind of war. The conflict had evolved into an industrial contest of scale, rotation, and sustainability. Japan's adaptations, however extreme, could not reverse that reality. By the time this truth fully settled in, the air war had moved beyond recovery. The shift in strategy marked not renewal, but acceptance. Japan fought on, but no longer with the expectation of regaining dominance. The skies had become a domain of loss management rather than opportunity. And as new tactics were deployed in desperation, the enemy prepared its final approach, armed with overwhelming numbers, refined systems, and the certainty that the war in the air had already been decided long before the last missions were flown. By the later years of the conflict, Japan's control of the skies had become a memory rather than a reality. What had once defined its early success, exceptional skill and coordination in the air, had gradually faded. Aircraft still flew. Pilots still answered alarms. But the confidence that once surrounded them had quietly disappeared. The belief in unquestioned dominance was replaced by a sober understanding that conditions had fundamentally changed. That realization became unavoidable as pressure from opposing air operations steadily increased. The loss of Japan's most seasoned aviators left growing gaps in experience that could not be easily filled. Long-distance missions by opposing forces became more frequent, supported by crews trained through systems Japan struggled to replicate. Engagements still occurred, but they demanded increasing effort for diminishing results. Over time, it became clear that control of the air was slipping away. There was a quiet contradiction in the response from leadership. Even as training standards and experience declined, expectations placed on remaining units grew heavier. Operational demands increased. Aircraft were deployed more frequently despite mounting logistical strain. Young pilots were sent into the air with limited preparation, facing opponents shaped by repeated operational cycles. Determination remained strong, but the framework supporting it was weakening. Resolve alone could not correct the imbalance. Change did not arrive through one defining moment, but through steady accumulation. Each successful operation against Japan reduced its ability to respond to the next. Airfields were disrupted. Industrial output declined. Transportation systems became less reliable. The air arm, once a tool of expansion, shifted into a defensive role marked by growing limitations. Efforts to challenge control of the skies became increasingly restricted in scope and effect. As the situation in the air turned against Japan, the impact extended well beyond aviation. Movements at sea grew riskier. Forces on the ground operated under constant observation. Urban centers, once distant from immediate danger, found themselves exposed. The erosion of air control accelerated setbacks across every domain, tying the outcome in the air to the broader direction of the war. At the heart of this decline was a fundamental reality. Japan's air doctrine depended heavily on individuals whose experience could not be quickly replaced. When they were lost, the system built around them lost cohesion. There was little depth to absorb prolonged strain. What remained was commitment without advantage, effort without lasting influence. By the final phase of the conflict, Japan's air forces were no longer shaping events. They were responding, launching missions to disrupt, delay, and impose limits where possible. Pilots continued to fly with resolve, aware of the challenges before them. Their actions reflected endurance rather than expectation. Control of the sky had become a matter of inevitability. The conclusion of the air struggle did not arrive in silence. Engines continued to run, defensive systems remained active, yet the outcome had already been decided. The decisive factors lay not in the final months, but in earlier choices, training structures, replacement capacity, and assumptions that could not sustain extended pressure. Without its most experienced airmen, Japan's approach to air power unraveled gradually through attrition, structural limits, and the realities of modern conflict. And as opposing aircraft came to dominate the skies, a lasting lesson emerged. Control is not maintained by brilliance alone, but by the ability to sustain strength long after brilliance has faded. By the war's end, Japan's elite pilots were remembered not as conquerors, but as tragic figures, men whose skill and sacrifice had been consumed by a conflict that outgrew them. Their names lingered in squadron histories and personal memoirs, spoken with reverence and grief. These were the pilots who had defined the early air war, whose precision and confidence once shaped the skies of the Pacific. Yet their legacy was inseparable from loss. They had fought with extraordinary ability, and they had vanished with unsettling speed. The shock of their absence extended beyond the battlefield. Japan's air forces, stripped of their most experienced leaders, bore little resemblance to the institution that had entered the war in 1941. Training programs were hollowed out. Doctrine was fractured. What remained was an echo of excellence without the foundation to support it. The men who followed flew bravely, but under conditions their predecessors had never faced, outnumbered, outmatched, and burdened by a system already in decline. There was deep irony in how their sacrifice was remembered. These pilots had been trained with meticulous care, molded over years into instruments of precision. Yet the system that produced them could not sustain itself once war demanded endurance rather than brilliance. Their loss did not inspire renewal. It exposed fragility. The very structure that celebrated excellence had no means to protect it. When the elite were gone, nothing of equal strength stood behind them. The turning point came quietly, long before the final battles. It arrived when Japan failed to preserve experience as a strategic resource. Unlike its adversaries, it did not rotate pilots out of combat in sufficient numbers, did not prioritize survival as a long-term investment, and did not build a training system designed for mass replacement. These decisions were not made in ignorance, but in adherence to belief in spirit, honor, and decisive victory. In a prolonged war, those beliefs proved inadequate. As the conflict ground on, the consequences compounded. Without experienced pilots, Japan could not contest the skies. Without control of the air, its navy and army were exposed. Without protection, its cities burned. The defeat that followed was not sudden or mysterious. It was the cumulative result of choices made when victory still seemed assured. The loss of its finest pilots marked the moment when Japan's war effort crossed a threshold it could never recross. The revelation is not one of failure of courage, but of structure. Japan's elite pilots did everything asked of them. They fought skillfully, adapted where they could, and endured conditions few survived. What failed was the system that treated them as inexhaustible. Once they were gone, no amount of resolve could recreate what years of experience had provided. In the aftermath, their legacy became a lesson written in silence rather than triumph. Modern air warfare, it was learned, does not reward brilliance alone. It demands sustainability, depth, and time. The skies favor those who can lose and recover, who can train and rotate, who understand that survival is not weakness, but strategy. Japan's elite pilots left behind more than stories of daring. They left a warning. Supremacy built on a narrow foundation cannot endure prolonged pressure. When the best are spent too quickly, collapse follows not from defeat in battle, but from exhaustion of possibility. They were among the finest pilots of their era, and in losing them, Japan lost not only the war in the air, but the future it had believed those men would secure. The consequence of Japan's early strategy became fully apparent only in the war's final phase. With its elite pilots gone and its training system exhausted, Japan turned to tactics born of necessity rather than design. Special attack missions kamikaze were no longer isolated acts, but an institutional response to imbalance. Aircraft were loaded with fuel and explosives, and pilots were briefed not on return procedures, but on impact angles. This was not an escalation of strength. It was an admission that conventional air power had been spent. The irony of this moment was profound. Japan had entered the war convinced that a small cadre of exceptionally trained men could decide its outcome. That belief shaped doctrine, training, and deployment. For a time, it appeared justified. Yet the very reliance on elite individuals created fragility. When those men were lost, there was no depth to absorb the shock. The strategy that had promised swift victory instead accelerated collapse once the war demanded endurance. Kamikaze tactics were presented publicly as expressions of resolve and sacrifice. Privately, commanders understood them as a measure of last resort. Aircraft were increasingly obsolete. Pilots were increasingly inexperienced. Fuel shortages limited training flights. In this environment, the probability of success in conventional combat dwindled. One-way missions offered certainty where maneuver no longer could. They required courage, not mastery, an important distinction, in a system that no longer possessed the latter in sufficient quantity. The revelation lay not in the bravery of the pilots assigned to these missions, but in what their deployment signaled. Japan's air strategy had inverted. Where once pilots were preserved as irreplaceable assets, they were now expended deliberately. The shift reflected a grim arithmetic. Without elite airmen to anchor the force, survival-oriented tactics were no longer viable. Impact replaced interception. Sacrifice replaced sustainability. This transformation underscored the cost of over-reliance. A force built around a narrow peak of excellence lacks resilience once that peak erodes. Japan had not invested in breadth rotational training, scalable instruction, or mass replacement. It had invested in perfection. Perfection, however, cannot be rushed or reproduced under pressure. When the elite were gone, the structure collapsed inward, leaving only extreme measures as options. The collapse was not sudden. It unfolded logically, step by step. as choices made in the war's early years constrained those available at its end. Every decision to keep veteran pilots at the front, every refusal to prioritize survival, every belief that spirit could substitute for systems contributed to this outcome. Kamikaze attacks were not an aberration. They were the final expression of a doctrine that valued decisive sacrifice over long-term sustainability. The revelation, viewed in hindsight, is stark. Over-reliance on a small group of elite men can produce rapid gains, but it courts disaster in prolonged conflict. When war becomes industrial and attritional, resilience matters more than brilliance. Japan's finest pilots were asked to carry the weight of an empire. When they fell, nothing was built to take their place. The price of over-reliance was paid not only in aircraft and territory, but in the lives of men sent into the sky with no expectation of return. Their courage remains unquestioned. The system that placed them there does not. And as the war drew to its close, the lesson hardened into history. Victory built on irreplaceable excellence may shine briefly, but it cannot last. For the few who survived, memory became a burden carried long after the war had ended. These men had flown beside pilots whose names would never appear in victory parades or post-war reckonings. They remembered faces more clearly than statistics, comrades lost not in the final collapse, but in the early and middle years, when the outcome still seemed uncertain and hope had not yet curdled into desperation. Many of the finest pilots were gone long before the world understood what their absence would mean. In quiet moments after the war, survivors spoke not of glory, but of absence. Empty bunks, familiar voices silenced between one mission and the next. These men had trained together, flown together, learned the air together. Their losses came before defeat was inevitable, before surrender was imaginable. They died believing they were shaping the war's course, unaware that the system they served would not endure long enough to justify their sacrifice. The irony of their legacy is difficult to escape. Japan's finest pilots are remembered as symbols of martial excellence, yet their story is inseparable from what followed: the improvisation, the desperation, the collapse of strategy. Their brilliance illuminated the early war, but it also concealed the fragility beneath. By the time their value was fully understood, they were already gone, leaving behind a force that could no longer sustain what they once made possible. In the years that followed, history compressed their story into abstraction. Numbers replaced names, tactics replaced lives. The air war became a study in doctrine and production, rather than in men who learned, adapted, and died in an unforgiving sky. Those who survived often felt their fallen comrades had been lost twice, first in combat and later in memory, overshadowed by the dramatic final acts of the war. The revelation lies in recognizing what was truly lost. This was not merely a depletion of skill, but the disappearance of a generation shaped by a specific moment in aviation history. These pilots bridged eras from biplanes to modern fighters, from individual combat to industrial war. They carried knowledge that could not be written down quickly enough, instincts learned only through survival. When they vanished, so too did an irreplaceable continuity. Their story is one of brilliance and tragedy intertwined. They were asked to fight a war that changed faster than the system supporting them. They gave everything to a strategy that assumed they could not be exhausted. Their courage delayed defeat, but could not prevent it. In the end, they became casualties not only of enemy fire, but of structural belief that excellence alone could overcome time, distance, and scale. Today, they are rarely remembered individually. Their aircraft sit in museums. Their tactics are studied in textbooks. But the men themselves, the quiet confidence before a mission, the shared understanding in formation, the unspoken fear remain largely absent from public memory. They were not the last to fall, but among the first. And in that sense, they were the war's most revealing loss. They were the forgotten heroes of the air war, not forgotten because they lacked significance, but because their sacrifice came too early, before defeat demanded explanation. Their lives marked the moment when victory slipped from possibility into illusion. And as history moved on, their absence spoke more clearly than any final battle ever could. In the end, Japan's failure to recover was not rooted in a single battle, weapon, or decision, but in something more fundamental. The nation had entered the war with some of the finest pilots ever trained, men shaped by years of careful instruction, hardened by experience, and refined into instruments of precision. Yet their survival proved too costly, and the war itself too unforgiving. What Japan possessed in brilliance, it lacked in resilience. The loss of these elite pilots marked a turning point that could not be reversed. They were not simply combatants. They were the connective tissue of the Air Force leaders, instructors, and living repositories of hard-earned knowledge. When they vanished, the structure around them hollowed out. Training became rushed. Doctrine lost coherence. Confidence gave way to compulsion. The air war did not collapse immediately, but it began to decay from within. Other nations adapted to prolonged conflict by institutionalizing survival. Pilots were rotated, rested, and returned as instructors. Experience was treated as capital, not expendable currency. Japan chose a different path, guided by belief in decisive victory and moral resolve. That belief carried it far in the opening months, but it offered no protection against time. When the war refused to end quickly, the cost of that philosophy became clear. The irony is that Japan's greatest strength hastened its downfall. By relying so heavily on a narrow band of exceptional men, it built an air force that could dazzle but not endure. Once those men were gone, there was no mechanism to recreate what had been lost. Excellence could not be accelerated. Experience could not be replaced. And the war, indifferent to intention, continued on its own terms. As the conflict ground forward, desperation filled the void left by mastery. New pilots flew with courage but without depth. Strategies emphasized sacrifice over sustainability. Survival ceased to be a priority and became a luxury. The air war, once a contest of skill, transformed into a grim arithmetic of attrition that Japan could not solve. This was the point of no return, not when cities burned, nor when fleets were destroyed, but when the last generation of elite pilots was gone. From that moment, Japan fought without the means to reclaim the skies. Every subsequent effort, no matter how determined, was shaped by that absence. The future narrowed, choices constricted, and outcomes hardened. History often remembers the end of wars in dramatic images: surrender ceremonies, ruined capitals, final battles. But Japan's defeat in the air was decided much earlier, in training fields and cockpit rotations that never happened, in pilots flown until exhaustion, in a system that mistook courage for sustainability. The war did not defeat Japan's pilots. It outlasted them. And so the moral closure is quiet but unavoidable. They had the finest pilots, but preserving them was too costly, and the war too unforgiving. Brilliance burned brightly, then vanished, leaving behind a force forced to fight on without its foundation. The greatest warriors were gone before the war was over, replaced by desperation.